So I'm going to attempt in this impossible 10-minute framework to assemble several usages of scale from the last several days. I will not use images, and I'm going to apologize right now for the accelerated and compressed nature of my own reflections. The rate of metabolism that in a way has been expected of the commentators who are sort of simultaneously in a mode of observing this past week and then kind of also filtering and operating as interlocutors has been exhilarating but also sort of schizophrenic. So you'll observe me trying to contort myself into a 10-minute format, which is not comfortable for me, but I'll do my best, and you'll cut me off when I talk too long. Okay, so several usages of scale or definitions of scale. So the first one I want to talk about, and probably the longest, is scale in the sense of spatial and temporal reach, which is immediately tied to problems of perspective and positionality. So in the first seminar I attended, Imaging the Anthropocene, Bron Zerzinski claimed that, quote, the Anthropocene is like the biggest monument ever, unquote. So the Anthropocene, broad planetary frames, thinking in terms of Earth systems, thinking in terms of deep time, and thinking in terms of the anthropos is somehow one consolidated entity. So I would argue that the Anthropocene as a term, like the satellite imagery so often deployed in connection with it, involves the inherent danger of subsuming many particularities into totalities and of naturalizing states of affair along the way. For example, the processes and structures through which various forms of environmental violence and social inequities come into being. I also wanted to just point out the scale of the Anthropocene campus and this kind of Anthropocene project at HKW itself is somehow mirroring or being reflective of this kind of model of aggregation and a kind of unwieldy scale that is simultaneously extremely ambitious, but is also something we should probably reflect on as we move forward. So for instance, this 700-page volume that may emerge out of it, is that the right scale? What does a scale like that do or not do? Okay, so one nice moment for me in the week was at this imaging seminar. Sverker Sørlin and Wolfgang Lucht each offered kind of short inputs about the histories of images and imaginaries of the globe and the planetary. And Sverker talked about this kind of ascendance of Earth system science and climate science, which is connected to the Anthropocene very closely. And he talked about the fact that while these kind of ways of thinking about the Earth as a complex system, maybe particularly within the sciences, draws from very long-standing strains of thought, that there also is very much a connection between how kind of frames of thinking and actual instrumentation, like sort of tools that are used, sort of emerged in connection with the Cold War, and particularly the US military. Actually, a couple of people have made that point to me, which I think is really interesting. So of course, at this moment in the late 60s, the cybernetic models that were touched upon earlier this morning, the satellite imagery, all of these things kind of come along or emerge also out of the rise of, as Sverker put it, kind of security industry, environmental security state. So I wanted to mention that. So what becomes visible or alternatively not visible or flattened depending on the scale of our view or frame? And I would just ask that you imagine, those of you who've seen it as our visual that's not here, Ray and Charles Eames' Powers of 10 film from 1977, which is a really interesting visualization about scale. So in one of our kind of discussions, Alejandra Torres Camprubi raised a really crucial issue, I think, about, in her mind, kind of the impossibility of thinking multiple scales at the same time. It was in the context of the subject of geoengineering. And if I got it right, what she was claiming is that fairness issues, so issues of kind of social or environmental justice, in a way are elided or occluded when we think about and speak at the scale or act at the scale of kind of geoengineering. And she suggested this model of a kind of Matryoshka doll, a nested kind of doll, as one other like way of thinking perhaps about multiple scales and perspectives at the same time. Okay, so what would it mean to perform a multi-scalar, multi-perspectival way of looking, thinking, acting, storytelling? What type of scalar thinking does the Anthropocene allow us to kind of make? What does it enable? Or what does it limit? These are questions that I find really important. And then this kind of self-reflexive piece of it for each of us moving forward. So the scales that we choose to work at, the scale of the problems we choose to address, the scale of audiences we choose to engage, the scale of what kinds of modes of both approaching our subject and approaching those with whom we want to communicate. What are the potential outcomes and stakes of those decisions about how we engage scale in our own work? Moving on. So another definition, scale is a verb. Scale as something that you do when there's an obstacle or wall in front of you that you want to get over, scaling a wall. So in the discussion last night between Amita Bhaviskar, sociologist, and Rivka Viehuizen, they were talking about kind of the production of knowledge and in relation to these institutions of funding and kind of the means to perform research. And they talked about how even though we might imagine that this kind of emphasis on interdisciplinary knowledge production, collaborative knowledge production, and also kind of globalization, that one might imagine that certain obstacles are being flattened. But Amita's point was that in fact they are becoming ever higher. These kind of walls that need to be scaled are becoming ever kind of more solid and high. For instance, in a limit such as language, so that in order to access funding for resources, to compete with others, to get just the actual means to produce one's research, that it has to be through this kind of bottleneck of the English language increasingly, and of using certain kinds of vocabularies or certain ways of speaking, which are quite, I think, also kind of specific to different disciplines. But in order to be able to articulate and gain the kind of means to articulate, that we have to deal with these kind of obstacles. Much more than others have to deal with the difficulty of these kind of blockages. An interesting comment I heard today from a participant here, I don't know if he's in the room, Seth Denizen. He was talking about this kind of threshold or wall somehow of this kind of looking forward to the future. That in some ways, this threshold between present and future has been a kind of point of blockage in a lot of discussions here this week. And the seminar I was in on anthropogenic landscapes, a really interesting moment was when the artist Natalie Jeremijenko proposed a kind of potential design intervention, or the idea that we might take all of our observations and analysis of a particular field site and move forward to the next step of actually creating a kind of material object. She doesn't use the intervention word. I would use the word intervention, kind of in a site. It was a trigger for tremendous kind of controversy and debate. So this is another threshold, perhaps, just to draw attention to something to potentially scale. Last but not least, and nested within, I think that, I'm not going to talk about it, but this definition of the scale is the actual instrument that's used to weigh things and to kind of via balancing and kind of comparative weight. I just wanted to add that in, which is tied to the quantitative. But I want to end on scale in terms of the kind of surface or covering of a fish or a reptile. So a fish scale, which I think is another kind of meaning to invoke, and I want to bring it up both because of the notion of the non-human, which I think is really essential to think through, and not only think through, but perhaps feel through, or to throw us into a kind of state of unknowing. So a fish scale in terms of the surface of a body, the interface between inside and outside, yet something that is also shimmering and iridescent. Now, of course, we could think of the close-up of the fish scale as a kind of object of scientific inquiry, biological, ecological inquiry. But I want to propose that the scale of the kind of close-up view of the empirical kind of scientific perspective has potential dangers just like the kind of planetary scale, and that at least in Western thought since the age of reason, the close-up view and empirical thinking has so often been tied to kind of dividing nature into the sort of an object, and the human is the kind of master subject. So I think in an ideal world, the Anthropocene troubles that and forces us to imagine other relations. So instead of thinking about the fish scale in terms of science, I want to think about the fish scale in the non-human, or I want to invoke the fish scale to kind of open on to the unfamiliar, the strange, radical otherness, limits of knowability. And one of the figures for me that was most compelling this week was, in fact, this woman, Charlotte King, who is kind of brought up in the project of the Otolith group that's downstairs and in the performance presentation they gave about it. Charlotte King is an earthquake-sensitive person who believes that she can read plate tectonic movement and kind of impending danger of earthquakes that are about to happen by pain in her body. Those of you who heard them talk, you've heard this before, but for some of the rest of you, I wanted to bring this in. So she believes, for instance, that an earthquake that's impending in a different part of the world will be registered in a particular part of her body. And so apparently, like, her hip, if she has pain, would point towards a possible earthquake in Pakistan. Something like this. She has a whole kind of set of relations between her anatomy. So their work is really worth looking into, and I'm not doing it justice by invoking it so quickly. But what I really thought was important about it was this kind of shift of registers that sort of speaks to, as it came up last night, sort of the material, the earthly, the geologic, and subjectivity and the human scale, kind of all at the same time. So I'll end there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emily, for this wonderful introduction and for connecting it. You can just stay there. We will slowly join you. And thanks a lot for connecting it to the campus. The first perspective on the term scale will be brought in by one of the instructors of the campus. We will hear Elena Bougleux. She is a physicist as well as a cultural and gender theorist by training. Today, she is an associate professor of cultural anthropology at the University of Bergamo and teaches anthropology of science at the Research Center on Anthropology and Epistemology of Complexity. So, please, Elena.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you very much. Shall I use this? Yeah, thank you, so I can hold the papers. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you which had the patience to stay up to this day, and also to the new ones, really welcome that joined us today. Is an impossible task, therefore you will be patient to the kind of synthesis that I made, which is very personal, very discussable, and provisional. Let's say that I'll go quickly through some keywords that I think could be useful, and also mainly what I want to do is suggesting 2 exercises. You're not supposed to do anything, just listen to the possible exercises to do in the future. So, Anthropocene apparently deals with molecules as components of the atmosphere. It deals with human communities, facing the changes of tidal rhythms, washing away their atolls, for example. And it also deals with planetary, global, fragile equilibria. Therefore, large, medium, and middle scales are present and visible. Very much so, either in time, in space, in resolution, in power, in degrees of confidence, in levels of accountability, and in degrees of engagement. And I thank you for the people in the seminars which had given me these suggestions. Micro, medium, and large scales in the Anthropocene are simultaneously activated. This is a key issue, of course. Different scale processes coexist in the same scenarios, which is one of the reasons why scenarios we are trying to face are complex. So complexity arises from the superposition of different scales, insisting onto the same topics. Actually, each traditional discipline, so our normal knowledge tools, the fields we are experts in, and let me call them traditional disciplines provisionally, is affected by the pressing need of resizing its own peculiar scale. So each discipline has developed its history and its competencies and its tool, its investigative tool, very peculiar, according to the size of its field. Microscope, telescopes, human meters, and so on and so forth. Don't want to go into lists again. But now my argument here is that disciplines have got to resize themselves, resize their own fields. On one hand, humans are, for example, understood as geological agents. It's been said broadly in these rooms around in these days. And this shift in the relevance of the humans tells the story of a big leap occurring in the quality of the human impact onto its context. So we are calling into the game the quality, not just the sizes. Here we are confronted, for example, with an urgent need, I would dare, of history to shift and to match recorded history and deep history. These two roots have to kind of talk to each other. And history becomes something like a global history. It's a discipline that's reshaping itself, or should do so, rather. On the other hand, going to the micro scale, micro events are seen as active agents of complexity. For example, we've been talking about the double history of the brain. Double history of the brain means that from evolutionary neurosciences, we argue out topics for talking about the ways we produce memory. So talking about evolution requires, calling to the game, the talking of co-evolution, another discipline which is facing a severe need of rephrasing its fields. So at the same time, well, I want to say that Anthropocene is not about large or small scale or numbers or impacts. It's about the need of, say, developing a skill to adapt one scale to another. And this is the first exercise. The very new enterprise, it's both an intellectual enterprise and a practical and a political enterprise, is that of, sure, remaining quite well acquainted of the relevance of our original traditional discipline and its fields and its peculiar scales, but with a very severe awareness of the need of connecting the scales one to each other. We need to be able to build jumps which don't let us lose resolution and capability of understanding. Each case studies, for example, we've been talking a lot about case studies. We were invited by the organizing team to reason in terms of case studies. So case studies, by definition, are limited things, so there are ways of putting boundaries around the research object, yeah, if you decide what you are concentrating on to. So dealing with the case studies, it's an operation, it's an investigative operation that requires a specific and scaled language. But then the meaning it acquires, the meaning unfolds when such an investigation is projected onto alien scales from its original ones. And I'm quoting again. So the meaning cannot be limited to the very specific scientific community that deals with that particular scale. So I go on and shut up here with the second exercise, which is about how we create interfaces among the different scales. We need to be able to jump from one scale to another, develop these skills, but the actual most interesting reason is the interface among the scales. Possibly, we have to, let me cut everything out. The new knowledge we need, let's say, is the one that is to be developed in that expanding bordering regions among existing scales. So the knowledge we need is neither here or there in the existing scales that we might be listing and mentioning about, but it's rather on the boundaries, which are not dimensionless units. They are rather expanding spaces. It's been talked about shifting boundaries between the discipline. I would rather say enlarging boundary regions among scales. And the places are where the new knowledge we need to handle this Anthropocenic thing might be developed. Thanks.
Thank you very much for this wonderful perspective. For me, it was almost impossible to detect from which disciplines you come. Probably you put in all your scientific and anthropological background and everything.
Yeah, I did.
That's wonderful. Now we will have, and thanks for challenging us with the 2 exercises. I think we should try them and discuss them. So now, but first we will have a second perspective. And here we have fresh blood in the campus. We have Tadzio Müller. We are very glad that he came. He's a political scientist, a climate justice activist and translator living here in Berlin. And he works for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. His research focuses on strategies of social transformation and social movements, working on questions of climate justice and the German Energiewende, the energy transition. Tadzio, please.
I was told I could also use this microphone so I can walk around a bit more, and because I'm like constitutively hyperactive, that's quite comfortable for me. So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very sorry I haven't been around. Maybe the injection of fresh blood can have some useful effects. For me, I'm very pleased to be here because as somebody who is in fact very much, when I give speeches, I'm always this mobilization aspect. I sort of tell you some analytical bits and then I say, all right, and now go and blockade this power plant or go and shut down this summit. Today I can just talk about problematics, and that's actually quite a nice change from the normal fetishism of mobilization. Nonetheless, I'll take a very sort of clearly political perspective and as such, not so much challenge the boundaries between disciplines. For me, the Anthropocene as a political problematic is in fact all about scale, both geographic and temporal. And I'll talk about the geographic scale first, and if I have time, which I won't, I'll talk about the temporal. In essence, on a geographic scale, the Anthropocene results from the existence of a capitalist world system which is driven by fossil fuels. So one world system has essentially brought about the existence of the Anthropocene. From a climate perspective, key danger in the Anthropocene is that another global system, a complex global system, the climate system, tips from a stable into an unstable state. And just briefly, that most of what we know as human civilization, you may have heard this 10 times, but so stop me, has come about in what we call the Holocene, a period of unusual climatic stability where the climate sort of didn't really vary more than 2 degrees plus or minus the mean. That's allowed for sedentary agriculture and what we know as human civilization. If the climate system tips from a stable into an unstable state, sedentary agriculture becomes very difficult. And with that, feeding 9 billion people, which will be by 2050, also becomes extremely difficult. So the possible effects on the climate system in the Anthropocene are disastrous. So we, this capitalistically supercharged humanity, we have effects on the global scale. However, so far, we totally lack the capacity to manage these effects at the global scale, at the global level. And that's the basic scalar contradiction of the Anthropocene, or it used to be quite similar with the globalization debate. Now, I refer to this as a kind of fucked up universalization. We have become the universal species that continental philosophy talked about so much, but it hasn't brought deliverance and liberation. It's in fact brought us very near to catastrophe. Now, we could say, as many folks who are active in the field of international politics tend to do, that what we need now is to simply empower, strengthen the United Nations, create a kind of global sovereignty to manage our own globality. Now, that's obviously not going to happen. But even if it were to happen, there'd be 2 problems with it. The first is ethical. We know that universalization creates a whole bunch of exclusions. Whose universality is it? Whose interests would be sacrificed for others that have just become universalized? So there is an ethical problem if you think about a global sovereignty. There's also what I think of as a computational problem. If you essentially think about the global economy as a highly complex system, and the global climate system as a highly complex system. Now, trying to manage those 2 is just computationally impossible. The global sovereign couldn't even compute what we need to do to essentially stop global climate chaos. So, although a global sovereign seems necessary from a climate perspective, it is also undesirable and impossible. So, that's basically the frustrating challenge of a climate politics today, or a climate justice politics. So for me, the political challenge of the Anthropocene, and I think there we're quite close, in terms of geographic scale, is to develop a multi-scalar transformative politics that can happen at one scale, say the local or the national or the regional, but have effects on another, in this case, the global scale. So one thing that we're trying to do, for example, is to create a transnational politics around the energy transition. And the German energy transition has, in fact, one of the most rapid expansion of renewable energies in a highly industrialized country. We know the Chinese government is very closely looking at what's happening here. Other governments are too. Is that a multi-scalar transformational politics? Because we change something here and then it might have effects in China. I don't really know, but this is kind of what we're trying to work out right now. And since I probably don't have another 30 seconds, I'll just very briefly speak to this problem of temporal scale. I come from the left, as is maybe obvious, and sorry, Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, yeah, that's kind of a giveaway. It's a giveaway, I know. So not the left party, but the left, the historic left. You know, and then sort of a classic left-wing temporality went like this. Martin Luther King said the arc of history bends towards justice. Tornsteiner Scherben said die letzte Schlacht gewinnen wir, we'll win the last battle. And you know, between Martin Luther King and Tornsteiner Scherben, it's clear the left thought in the end things get better. From an ecological perspective, in the Anthropocene, things are going to turn to shit. So that's actually also an interesting temporal scale problem. Like, it changes the temporality of political practice completely, because suddenly, towards the end, you don't see liberation, but you see catastrophe. So those are the two challenges I find myself in. Maybe we can have a productive discussion about them. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Tadzio, thank you very much for challenging us with another capacity needed, that is to manage the global scale, and then, of course, the need for interfacing the mesoscale with the global scale. Are there questions now? I immediately open the floor. Thilo?
Thank you.
Not
Thanks
only
for the
questions, comments, ideas, contributions, and it's not a Q&A between this table and the audience. You can really discuss all together. We can discuss.
Thanks for the fascinating presentations. This is sort of a provocative comment. I'm a human geographer, and geographers have, of course, filled volumes discussing the notion of scale and what its value is. There's an article from about 10 years ago which was called Human Geography Without Scale. And I was wondering, I mean, you just said it's everything about scale, but then I got the notion that the feeling that everything you did was talking about how scale doesn't actually fit, because we have to, there are things crossing scales, we're jumping scales, scales are embedded in each other, scales are like expanding towards one another. And I was thinking, what's actually, like, why do we need that notion of scale? Aren't we like using a concept of thinking that we are kind of familiar with, but that's actually more in the way of trying to understand the processes and the networks and the effects that these networks have on the environment and so forth? Why do we need that? Like, how does it help our thinking, really? And isn't it in the way more?
I think in this case yeah.
Scales are a legacy from the past. Scales are the way disciplines were organized, and they were sharing the scales one each, and you do your business in your own limited scale. Scales are a legacy from the past.
I'm about to very strongly disagree, but maybe I'm not allowed to right now. Of course you are. But basically, from a political perspective, do you vote for a global president? No. Do you vote for the German chancellor? Well, not as such. You vote for a party that elects the German chancellor. However, that's very clearly an institutional reality of a scale. There's the German scale, there's the European scale, and then there's the UNFCCC.
They disappeared.
Yeah, but they're not. Yes, but they are relevant at a political level, because you're talking about the space which is manageable by a political entity.
Okay. More contributions, questions? Matteo, did you raise your hand? Yeah.
Just a question for Tadzio. Are you aware that today we can describe climate change only thanks to computation? You said before that, I misunderstood probably. You were saying that this computing level we cannot reach, it is like a limit of computability, of understanding. Paul Edwards was here these days, wrote this fantastic book, A Vast Machine, that described how climate change in the Anthropocene is possible as a cognitive construct, as an hypothesis, as a kind of hyper-object, only through this technosphere, this network of sensor, and also this network of computer mega supercomputer, and so through a massive, big scale of computation. And only thanks to that we can talk. Maybe there's the only reason why you're here today.
Okay. More questions? Contributions? No?
There's one back there.
Okay.
I'm one of the brain dead participants, but I try. I can still think in exercises, so that's what I manage. And just an experience from the last days, connecting scales and sizes with other disciplines, and also adapting other case studies, like to the own discipline and the own scaling. And I thought in the last animated filtering seminar, we really did that excessively. Mm-hmm. And for me, this was the hardest learning process. I mean, I think myself as an interdisciplinary, interest in cultures, open-minded person, but this is really hard to put another filter, another scale on your own discipline, working with cases from the own discipline, with another filter, with another perspective, with another scale, but also, what do I know about the forests in the Narmada Valley? What do I know about the flow of the river of the Mississippi? It is really, it's a challenge to think in other scales, in other filters. For me, this was the hardest learning process the last days.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I want to respond by offering a kind of proposal because of this a kind of a criticism I heard today floating around about this kind of need to put down, to make a kind of stake or a claim or to put forth proposals, which also put us in a kind of position of creating things that have contradictions and fault with them. So as a kind of way, I'm really interested in this question. I came to this conference because I've been conceptualizing for a long time a class that I'd like to teach in an architecture department in a university that has some of the scientists in the world who are the most famous for producing models of climate science. So I'm not a specialist, it's not my field, but I'm really interested in the way that something like climate change presents a kind of representational dilemma, and that it also, for me, poses a kind of interesting pedagogical design problem, because it is something I'm concerned about. It's something I want my students to be concerned about. But how do I go about teaching it in a way that is not abstract, that is not consolidated, and that requires lots of modes of, or lots of kinds of knowledge that I don't myself possess? So I partly came here to meet other people who I potentially could collaborate with to co-produce this class or to learn from in order to gain what I need to teach it. But I also, and I throw it out just as a proposal, and I would love feedback if people afterwards are willing to offer it, of what would it look like to teach a class where every week there was a different kind of site which had a different scale, a different maybe even categorical kind of element to it, and a different facet of climate change. So one week, this site is the atmosphere and questions of carbon trading, the economics of carbon trading. One week is the Maldives and deals with questions of social justice and environmental diaspora. One week deals with an IPCC, or with some kind of climate change, or a COP meeting, the upcoming COP meeting, as a kind of site of political and legal and discursive kind of dealings with what produces climate change. One week looks at permafrost melting, but attempts to kind of deal with it from a non-human position of the permafrost or the mud itself. So these are really, it's not only about scale. I think scale is actually important for me in my own thinking. It's useful, not because it's a fixed thing and it's anything but neutral, but it somehow provides a spatial and temporal kind of language. But then I feel like this multi-register and multi-perspectival aspect is equally important. They're all kind of entangled with each other, but it presents really interesting problems for how you address and teach about and practice kind of in ways that are not consolidating.
Shall I go back to Matteo's question?
Yes.
So, Matteo, with respect to your question, I would distinguish between computing the global climate system, which is essentially done by assuming that there are, say, 3 standard paths the world economy could take. You have a business as usual, you have minor emissions reductions, you have major emissions reductions. That's sort of the way you compute the climate system and include the world economy. But I was talking about computing and implementing the global plan, in which you would have, the global plan, basically post-communist. You know what I mean. Which I said is both necessary and undesirable, and I'm saying in that sense impossible, because you're talking about 9 million human variables. So, for example, if a part of the global plan is that fossil fuels are to be left in the ground in all parts of the global north, which would be a reasonable element of the plan, how do you compute the different responses between Swedish, British, and German trade unions, which would all respond very differently to a shutdown of fossil fuel extractions? That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, I mean, there's also a problem in terms of computing climate systems that say when a tipping point is reached. I think, as far as I understand, most climate scientists will tell you that is impossible to precisely compute. You can say certain likelihoods in a certain time frame, so there are these problems, but again, computing the climate system is different from computing the global plan. And I think we have some interesting elements of experiments from Allende's Chile, which were obviously shut down by the coup. But I would say this problem remains, because dealing with several billion humans in a calculation and a computation is far more complicated than just saying there are 3 basic scenarios and we'll just calculate them.
I have a very simple question. So in the model session, there was this kind of criticism that choosing the term model as a key term for an Anthropocene curriculum would be a kind of techno-scientific vocabulary. Do you have the same impression of the term scale? Is this techno-scientific approach? Does it, or is it a broader approach that we could somehow agree on? That's a question to everybody, but if you like to answer.
Can I say very briefly? I'm making a point to speak slowly. People that know me can appreciate these efforts. Okay, I think that definitely it's a more flexible word than model. I was not in that discussion, but I would have voted against model as a keyword, whereas I voted in favor of scale, because scale is a function of time. So the way I answered to Thilo, saying they are a legacy from the past, unfortunately didn't imply yet that they don't exist anymore at all. What I'm saying is that scales have been the pretext and also the tool, sometimes an effective one, to fragment the knowledge we need in disciplines. And the disciplinarities have been, so the specialization in disciplines have been a way to enact local powers very deep-rooted within strict scientific communities that were unable to speak to each other. So the issue of breaking the scales, and so what I called before as in a joke, jumping between the scales, so absolutely mastering at least 2. Otherwise, where do you jump from? Where do you jump to? Of course, you have to know exactly well what you mean when in your own discipline you're talking about scale and where you want to go when you're, for example, considering to move to a smaller or larger or longer or shorter or whatever other scale. I'm saying that to be stabilized within a certain framework in space and time and power and energy and resolution, and the list could be longer, is a way of not addressing the global view we need. So this is why I think the scale is a good tool, as long as we can reframe them. We also spoke a lot about framing. I was about scale/frame, because they are tools or filters, right, as that we have to readapt. In this sense, I go along with scale, with a function of time, rapidly changing one.
Is there anybody who likes to criticize that? So do we agree, except Thilo maybe, that scale should be one of the key terms? Or is this contested or not?
Can we get a brief definition of what you mean by scale? What is a scale?
That's such a geographer's question. Damn. Well, I suppose specifically, I'm talking about institutions and the reach that they have. So you don't need to, like, it's certainly not necessary to refer to them as local, national, regional, or global. And for me, the question is, or rather maybe it's not even institutions, because I imagine institutions have political effects. For me, it's the question of how far do you reach with your political effects? And so yes, with a sort of, that could be said to dissolve scale, but given that actually existing political institutions like the UN like have an implied global reach, whereas say a national government has a different implied reach. Now those things aren't neatly, obviously the US government has a different reach than the Monaco government, for example. Like they have different reaches, but those institutional frames remain relevant as the addressees of political strategies. And insofar, I'd say, yes, with a bunch of caveats, I would stick to the term. I'm not sure I can define scale right now.
If I may,
They belong to
like,
disciplines. So we could give as many definitions as disciplines
Possibly, yeah.
I actually like the notion of reach that you brought in, because it actually points to like what the quality of these actions are. And like what you gave as an example before, like the state and then Europe and then the United Nations actually doesn't work for me, because the European Union has a reach on certain aspects in my daily life that the state doesn't have, but my state does have a reach into European matters to an extent that the European Union as an institution wouldn't have, right? So like presupposing that they are operating at different scales in a spatial sense doesn't actually make sense. I totally agree that they have different reach on different things to different extent. But that's why I mean, like, what is scale really? Because I think if we use the term, we're often referring to very different things. Is it a range, a reach in issues, in matters that it can be addressed? Is it a spatial reach? Is it in a level of abstraction and so forth? That was my question about what is scale really.
Here's another contribution.
Thank you. I hope that I do not cut, actually, but the discussion was really interesting, I hope, because I have a comment from a little bit other origin, and maybe you have something to answer to this comment. And
I was quite fine with that, you know. I'm going to
or any one of other participants? Okay. Here, anyhow, like, I mean, I was puzzling about the question of scale, because it was presented in a kind of like a little bit contradictory way. On the one hand, it allows to build some kind of like homogeneity, because the things can be compared, or like it kind of builds a term on which it is possible to put the things whether on top of each other, like the unit of measurement and the scale through the unit and the resolution, or like close to each other, that they're going to border. And on the other hand, there was another kind of sense in this multiplicity of the scales, like how you were describing this, that it actually scale makes a heterogeneity of the field. And in that sense, it's a kind of like, for me, it has both. It oscillates between the both meanings all the time when we talk. And it kind of brings an interesting example that I was reading about in the Isabel Stenger's book about and in the chapter actually about the complexity and emergence that was discussed there, which is the multiplicity of practices, which I assume has to do with Althusser actually, without quoting anything like from Althusser, which is with the question of overdetermination. And there, it is really an interesting how it is proposed to reconcile between the practices on the different levels, because when the simplest example was of molecular water, when the water can be chemical element, can be water and can be molecular, and it always emerges from the different discipline. And the discipline assumes the different scale, but the scale is not comparable. They don't have an eminent term except of what they discuss. When the disciplines struggle around the definition, then the eminent term arrives. But there is no, so to say, like transcendent eminent term, which is predefined from before. And then it is the question of the computation for me, because in order for a system, global system, economical system to be computed in advance, there shall be something created in advance of the discussion on the basis of which things has to be computed. So, like, it might be a value like equality, which can be defined in advance, like capitalism can do everything except equality. Okay, let's try to make a computational system of equality. Or it might be some more like technical terms. So, and for me, it has really become this kind of, then the question of do we really come to this imminent term at the moment of the discussion, or as or we can critically arrive to some kind of like almost transcendent definitions for our computational systems. So again, homogeneity and the heterogeneity comes as the function of time. And that's my reflection, and that's why I didn't want to tell it now, because there was a very practical discussion about the states and the United Nations before I started to talk.
Yeah, sorry, we are jumping, but I think there's no other possibility. We have to have several discussions at the same time. But for me, that's okay, probably. Do you like to respond to that?
What about I suggest my second exercise, just for a provision, I think. Why don't we speak about, don't we try to phrase the interesting things that have been said in terms of interfaces between scales? Shall we get out, try not to get stuck? Apparently there's a problem with scales. If we don't even know how to transcend them, I'm a bit uneasy with the transcendency bit, but okay, you put that thing to the table, right? Actually, there's a feeling of, a limitation in these views. I think, in this attempt you are doing to overcome some limit that a scale, whatever way I define it, is put onto your topic, right? This is why, I think I just made it too short, and you are right, you were right in cutting me, but the idea of creating interfaces among scales is exactly this. And it's, again, I owe this idea to the rest of the group. I mean, I'm just trying to make my best to summarize it. The idea is that the way we projected a mental filter onto reality in order to be able to analyze it and deal with it, I'm not trying to say that we should just chuck away, get rid of everything we know so far, but apparently this is no longer enough. This is no longer enough, and I feel a lot of resonance of not being satisfied anymore, also in Thilo's answers and in your points now, right? Therefore, interfaces, I like this word, which come, if you want to place me somewhere in disciplines, in physics, because the transition of phase, of course, is a very delicate and non-descriptible moment. It is really rapid in time, short scale, immensely intense in terms of dynamics, right? So very difficult to model. And we're going again and again around three keywords, all the same, right? So the interface, if we take it as a metaphor, and let's get rid of physics for a bit, but keep it that in mind, is actually a new space. It's not that I'm jumping from 1 to 2 along my meter, right? I need something in between, which is qualitatively different. I want to call it the new kind of knowledge. I want to call it the new political space, some place for accountability to be developed. How do I account for something which is of a bigger, so much bigger scale than mine? How do I really feel responsible or enact sensible actions for the Maldives example that Emily got into the game? If I live in this square meter here in Northern Europe and I'm also confident with my microphone, what sense does it make? I need a jump scale, and I need to work on these interfaces, which are a rephrasing of our existing Althusserian categories. In my view, very personal.
I just want to mention, short and sweet, one thing I like about the term scale is precisely that I think it is inherently about contingency and relations. Like, there is no such thing as scale if it's not in relation to something. There's something that's extremely kind of relational about it that I think holds a lot of potential in terms of us thinking and always kind of rethinking where we're at. And it also, I think, automatically raises this question of positionality.
But I think that what you just said about the relations, and I think that I'm asking myself all the time about how to work with this multiple scales as well. And I think that the thing that we have to change in our thinking is, I'm just thinking loudly, more or less, because I'm processing the information for myself as well. But I think that the difference is, we have been talking about scales in, you said, homogeneous body, or for explaining difference. But I think all the time we are talking now about scales in some categories that are like kind of Fordist, because it's the first scale, the second scale, the third scale, and it's a kind of linearity in them. And I love the aspect of interfaces, because I have been working all the time with the systems between these scales. And it's not just the relations between the scales, because there is a bigger scale, I am a smaller scale. It's not that, but it's the way the system works, and I'm communicating with scales. So it makes a difference in a political way as well, where you were saying Europe or country or whatever. I can define Europe as a scale, and I can define myself as a scale, and I can define Germany as a scale. But what this exchange process, the system between these moments of scales, is what makes a huge difference. And I think that is what we have to understand differently to think scales beyond this for these categories of the past that we're trying to organize in very precisely moments and spaces and times and frames, and try to understand the process in between through interfaces, for example.
Yeah, I think the interfaces are really one of the hardest part, even if you stay within a discipline. So I'm a physicist. I come from physics of complex systems. And of course, in physics, this has been done a lot, like transitioning from the ultra short time scale to a long time scale, or small spatial scales to larger scales, this emergent behavior, for example, in spatial patterns. And of course, within physics, there have been methods developed how to do these transitions, and you can do them either sharply, or you can jump, or you can make a smooth transition. So within a discipline, it's already hard, and now if we jump even between disciplines, that makes it even harder. I don't know, are there some concrete examples for that? Or?
Physics, no, because in the meantime I was switching towards the anthropological mode. I was thinking to be really concrete, yeah, about some. Can I speak? The one that grabbed the mic all the time. I'll shut up later. Okay, I'll moderate myself.
That's
also.
why I just wave. When she asks me, I just wave.
Right. No, we been developing a part of our seminar outside in a sort of very short field work, and I was concerned. I think one of our participants, Marta, I'm not sure I see her here. She was, we went to investigate an industrial site here in Berlin, in Eastern Berlin, and she was about to look for the traces of waste, because this was her research is about how you deal and manage and recycle waste. We were in one of the most polluted area of Berlin, and actually at the end of the afternoon there, she was kind of disappointed. Marta, if you're here, please raise your hand, otherwise I have to interpret her words. We spoke quite a bit. She couldn't see waste. She said, where's the waste? It was really polluted, the soil, the air, there was no legal regulations there, the water system, and all the worst. I'm not going to into these details, but it was a very practical type of field work, and a short one, so very provisional and temporary one, but very, very, very material, and in a dirtiest place that we could find around here, right? Really short, 40 minutes Aspen ride from here. So what was the problem there? What transition was needed in order to be able to look for waste in some very important and sophisticated definition she has of waste, because she works on that, yeah? To be able to spot the corresponding item there that apparently was invisible. So this is a transition. Something has happened there that has made such a thing. They're invisible, untouchable, unperceivable. So it was very, very concrete there. So there was a change in scale, of course, because the chemicals could not be seen, could not be touched, maybe we were breathing it, but not being aware of it. So there was a problem on scale, but also of the interface, because she wanted to transform some of her thoughts, developed before on some research, on that particular type of waste, which didn't work. Of course, that was just an exercise, it was a temporary thing. So it's very practical. The interface is not a theoretical space, it's very physical. And there's no one answer. I made this example, but I'm sure other paradigm can be taken up from other examples.
Okay, thank you. Okay, very last short comment, or
No, we'll probably open
because
up
I get
too much
signs
stuff
that
again,
we
so
should finish.
Leave on that note of opening up but not resolving that.
Oh, sorry, there's one voice in the audience. Sorry.
Hi. I'm speaking as a semi-informed outsider. And I think what strikes me the most is the fact that the idea and kind of the geologic reality of the Anthropocene is at a scale that we don't really know how to deal with. And for me, that's where scale is important. I mean, scale is a tool to be used in any discipline and in a way to talk about things so that we can all understand each other. But being here, what I'm hearing is that we're talking about something at such a large scale that we are unprepared really to deal with it. And I feel like that also is the power behind it, is that we're kind of all in this together, and we have to deal with something at a scale that we really don't know how to deal with.
Yeah.
At this point, then I will need one last sentence. Because the interesting point from an ecological perspective is that we're all in this together, but those who are not here will die first. So the thing for me, and maybe I do use the wrong terms because I kind of stopped doing theory and now I read about what energy systems you need and how much storage is in a car battery. But I'm thinking about maybe in other terms, universal and particular. Like, we have all these universal effects, but they're obviously staggered. They're universal, but they're not the same for everybody. And the institutions that have universal reach, say global corporations, they are the bad ones. We have no good universality. All we have is a kind of fucked up universality. And that's kind of what I'm concerned about. Maybe scale is not the right vocabulary, but that is my fundamental problem. How do we create a sort of positive universalization after having achieved a severely fucked up universalization in the capitalist world system that we've been driving for 250 years? Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have to close here. Thanks a lot.